Before I talk about how we are doing with our preparations for the summit, I just want to firstly talk about the history of our involvement in the G20 as South Africa. Some of you colleagues will know that the G20 was formed around 1997, 1998 as a result of what was then called the Asian financial crisis. This crisis was affecting a number of countries in East Asia, for example, Malaysia, Thailand, South Korea, some parts of China, including Hong Kong, as well as Taiwan. So the world was affected negatively by that crisis, which spread across all the countries and all the regions of the world. So some of the countries started to toy with the idea of bringing different countries in the world to respond to that financial crisis, to arrest the crisis, and to ensure that there's a framework to prevent such a crisis from recurring. So at the initiative then of the United States of America, working with other G7 countries, those countries were mainly countries in the West, which was the United States, Canada, Italy, and UK, France. So they came together to say, as a G7, we do not cover the world sufficiently and we will not be able to respond to the crisis. We need more countries to be involved. So they involved other countries. At that time, they formed the G20 as a meeting of ministers of finance and central bank governors. So when the G20 started during that period in 1998, 1999, it started as a gathering of ministers of finance and the central bank governors. So it grew over the years to be what it is today. But then when the G20 was formed, they looked at the countries in the world that could assist in arresting that financial crisis and ensuring that we prevent a recurrence. On the African continent, South Africa was the only country that was invited to form part of the G20. And as you can see behind me, we've got the flags of all the G20 countries. So these are the countries that were invited to form. The only new member of the G20 is the African Union. The flag of the African Union is this one, the green one. So besides the African Union, we have obviously South Africa, the African Union, and then we've got Argentina, you've got Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, then you've got the European Union, which is the blue flag with the stars, the gold stars, got France, Germany, India, Indonesia, can't see the flag, I believe it's Italy, Japan, Mexico, South Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, can't see that flag properly, it's Turkey, and then we've got the United Kingdom and the United States of America. So those are the countries that form the G20. Amongst them, we've got only two regional organizations, which is the African Union and the European Union. So the G20 was formed by those countries, and South Africa was the only country on the African continent which was invited to be a member of the G20. As you can see, other countries, we've got a group of countries from Europe, we've got a group of countries from Asia, and then you also have a group of countries from South America, for example, Brazil and Mexico. So on the continent of Africa, South Africa was the only member. And when the G20 grew to be a leaders summit, that was occasioned by another financial crisis in around the year 2008, when we had the global financial crisis, which began in the United States of America, and it spread across the world. So again, the leaders of the world decided that we must elevate the G20 to a leaders forum so that the leaders can take decisions quickly on what had needed to be done at that time. And so the president of the USA at the time, I think it was President George W. Bush, he invited world leaders. South Africa's president at the time was also invited, and the leaders of the other G20 countries. So they began to meet at the summit level from then until now. So South Africa is the last country to host a G20 Leaders Summit. All the countries had held the G20 Leaders Summit. South Africa is the last one in this cycle to host the G20 Leaders Summit. So during our presidency of the G20, we are going to be doing a review of the G20's work over the past 20 years to look at how far we have come as the G20 and what we need to do differently to ensure that the G20 functions optimally and that it fulfills its mandate, which was to ensure that we ensure cooperation among the G20 countries, but also beyond the G20 with other countries that are invited to participate in the gatherings of the G20. So South Africa is taking this huge responsibility, not for its own sake, but also on behalf of developing countries in general, because we're championing in the G20 the interests and the desires of fellow developing countries. In the G20, most of the countries, as you can see, are developed countries. There are only a few countries that are developing, for example, South Africa, and the previous president of the G20, which is Brazil, as well as the two other previous hosts, which is India and Indonesia. So those are the developing countries in the G20. South Africa is one of them. And the rest of the countries, these are developed countries, and we are working with them to ensure that there is cooperation at the global level on issues on the G20 agenda, which I will speak to later. But then South Africa's G20 presidency, we are using it to champion the interests of the African continent, because we take our membership of the G20 as an opportunity for other African countries to amplify their voices through this forum. So we're using our membership indeed to ensure that the African voice is heard and the African interests are championed through the platform of the G20. So one of the interests of South Africa and other African countries, as well as developing countries, which is a priority of South Africa's presidency, is to ensure that we strengthen disaster resilience and response. This is one of the priorities that we set forth when we took over the presidency, and all the G20 countries supported that this could be something that we are working together on, which is directly related to some of our national interests, but also disaster resilience and response is a matter that is firmly on the international agenda, and it is not only relevant for South Africa and the African continent. So that was one of our priorities. We are also, as South Africa, championing another priority, which is to ensure debt sustainability for low-income countries, a matter that the African Union is seized with. South Africa has a huge interest in ensuring that there's debt sustainability for low-income countries, many of which are on the African continent. So we have the endorsement of the G20 members to put this on the agenda and ensure that there is agreement in the international community on how we assist low-income countries to manage debt so that they are able to focus on other issues of development. Some of the countries on the African continent, they are so indebted that they cannot even prioritize basic things such as health care, education, access to water, those basic things. And when those countries are not able to manage debt and they spend most of their finances on servicing debt, they are not able to provide basic services for their citizens. And as South Africa, you know, the influx of our neighbors into South Africa, it's mainly as a result of some of those issues where our African sister countries are battling with the provision of basic services to the people because of issues such as the debt which they are unable to manage and repay. So it's a matter that the South African government has put forth, and we have the endorsement of our G20 partners. The other issue that is high on our agenda is to harness critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. It's a matter that the people of the Northwest are very familiar with, the fact that the African continent and South Africa in particular is a huge supplier of these critical minerals, but how do we ensure that the minerals are used for sustainable development and for poverty eradication as well as development? This is a matter that I will be listening very attentively to the speakers as they talk about, because it affects the daily lives of the people, not only in the Northwest Province, but across the African continent. And then South Africa is obviously working to ensure that our G20 presidency is inclusive. Inclusivity means that we are not going to have a closed-door meeting of the G20 members only. We've invited other countries to participate. Some of the countries that we've invited have traditionally been participating in the G20 through the years. They are not members, but they have a huge input to make onto the agenda of the G20 countries, such as Spain. We've invited countries like Malaysia. We've invited countries also in the African continent, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Angola, Egypt. In fact, some of the meetings that South Africa has chaired under the G20 presidency have taken place in other African countries because, as I said, we want our G20 countries to bring the African voices onto the agenda. So we've held meetings in Nigeria, we've held some of the G20 meetings in Egypt. That is part of South Africa bringing the African continent along with us on the journey of our presidency. So we've invited also regional and international organizations. The United Nations will participate, the African Union as a member, but some of its institutions will also participate in the summit. We've invited countries in the Caribbean, for example, Jamaica will be participating. So South Africa's G20 presidency is going to be an inclusive one that makes sure that we don't only speak on behalf of developing countries, but that they are in the room and their voices are heard through the platform that we are providing for them on the G20 agenda. Now, I'm going to conclude by just referring to our state of readiness to host the G20 summit. Colleagues will know that this is taking place next month, as I said earlier, on the 22nd and the 23rd of November. It is not a national government project, it is South Africa's presidency, so it is your summit as a South African, and I'm very glad that those of you who are in the hall will be now, from today, you are our G20 ambassadors. So when people see the G20 summit on the TV and they ask what's happening, I will rely on you to explain to them what is happening, because it will be South Africa's moment to bring the world together, to unify everyone, and to ensure that we come out of that summit with a set of agreed principles on how we address issues of international development, of peace and security, and also ensuring that we deal with issues of sustainable development, economic growth, etc. So South Africa is ready. All the G20 countries will be participating without any exception. Some of the countries we have invited, which are not G20 members, they are also looking forward to participating in the G20 under South Africa's presidency. And we are also, as part of our summit, preparing for a platform that will be used to galvanize community organizations, grassroots organizations, groupings representing all sectors of society during what we call the G20 Social Summit, which will take place just a few days before the Leaders Summit. The Social Summit will take place from the 18th of November until the 20th in Ekurhuleni in Boksburg at the OR Tambo International Conference Center. And that is intended to ensure that those who are not able to participate in the Leaders Summit, because the Leaders Summit is the Leaders Summit, only the G20 leaders and their invited leaders will participate. So South Africa, like Brazil, is organizing a platform to ensure that non-governmental organizations, civil society, all the grassroots organizations come under one roof and agree on a set of goals and decisions that must be taken and tabled at the G20 Leaders Summit. So our president will be at the G20 Social Summit, and he will listen to all the inputs from the different civil society, grassroots organizations. At the end of that social summit, they will present a declaration or a set of demands depending on how they want to word it. And our president will then take that declaration to be presented to the G20 leaders. And that is how we're going to ensure that the voices of the people are heard at the G20 Leaders Summit, as will be presented by our president. So that is how we are intending to run our G20 presidency. It will conclude after the summit. The next president of the G20 will be the United States of America, and South Africa's presidency will conclude at the end of November. So from the 1st of December, the next president of the G20 is the United States. South Africa will be serving in the Troika because the G20 doesn't have a permanent secretariat. So South Africa has been part of the Troika of the G20, which is comprised most usually of the previous president of the G20, the current president, and the next president. So when Brazil was serving as the president last year, we were already serving in that Troika as the incoming president. The outgoing president at the time was India. So the three countries are responsible for ensuring that they agree on the agenda and they present it to the next, to the bigger gatherings of the G20. So South Africa will be serving again in the Troika, but it's usually up to the president of the G20 how they want to conduct the business of the G20s, but South Africa will be offering its support to the next president of the G20, which is the USA. With those words, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to listening to all the inputs, and we will definitely take the messages from Rustenburg back to Pretoria, and we will definitely convey a message that Rustenburg is indeed part of our presidency, and they've given us full support. Thank you very much, President Director.